Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at John 2, and specifically the wedding at Cana and the cleansing of the temple. And, you sent over those excerpts from Sproul's commentary on this, so let's see what we can pull out of that together.
Yeah, John 2 is a really interesting chapter because it kind of puts these two very seemingly different stories right next to each other. And, what does a joyous wedding have to do with a pretty dramatic confrontation in the temple? And yet, when you look at it, you see there's actually quite a bit that they have in common, and we can explore some of that deeper symbolism as we look at these two passages.
Yeah, so let's start with that wedding at Cana. I mean, it's kind
Yeah.
of interesting that, Jesus picks a party to perform his first miracle et decay. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, weddings back then weren't just like, an afternoon kind of thing. These were huge celebrations that could go on for a whole week. So you can imagine if you were the host of this party and you ran out of wine, that's not just, oh, we're out of drinks. That's a major social faux pas. You could even get sued for that. So it was a big deal.
Yeah, that puts a whole new spin on the phrase party foul. But, the thing that I kind of notice here is Mary's role in this. I mean, she goes up to Jesus and she says, they have no wine. And it's almost like she knows that he can do something about it.
Yeah, throughout John's gospel, you see Mary's awareness of Jesus's unique abilities. And, I think that's kind of on display here. And of course, we have Jesus's response to her, which, is often misunderstood. He says to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come."
Yeah, it's easy to read into that like with a modern day kind of lens, like, oh, is he being kind of snarky with her? But I don't think that's what's going on there.
No, not at all. I mean, first of all, woman was actually a very respectful term to use in that era. And so he's not being disrespectful to Mary, but he's just kind of gently, reminding her that his actions are guided by divine timing, not by, people's, kind of social pressure.
Right. So it's not like he's saying, you know, uh, why are you bothering me with this? But it's more like, hey,
Yeah.
you know, I got this, but it's not quite time yet. But then, of course, he does perform the miracle, and he doesn't just make, a little bit of wine. He makes like a whole lot of wine.
That's right.
You know,
He uses these 6 enormous stone water pots that would have been used for Jewish purification rituals. And in those 6 pots, he creates just an unbelievable amount of wine. Some estimates say maybe 120, 180 gallons of wine.
that's a lot of wine. Like, I mean, that's enough to keep this party going for a long time. So, one thing I'm curious about too is, Sproul's pretty adamant that this isn't just grape juice, that this is, alcoholic wine.
He is, yeah. And while some interpretations try to downplay that aspect of it, it's important to remember that wine was a very, significant cultural and religious, you know, item in ancient Jewish society. It was seen as a gift from God, a symbol of joy and celebration.
Yeah, so it kind of challenges our modern day assumptions about, the place of alcohol in religious context. So, um, beyond just the literal aspect of this miracle, what do you think this tells us about Jesus?
Well, this miracle is layered with a lot of symbolism. And I think one of the big things that we see is this transition from the old to the new. So you have water that would have been used for these Old Testament purification rituals being transformed into wine for a wedding feast. And so this kind of points towards, this transition from the old covenant to the new covenant that's inaugurated by Christ.
So it's like he's ushering in a new era, a
Hmm.
new way of relating to God. And I think the abundance of the wine also speaks volumes too, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It signifies that boundless nature of God's grace that's freely given to all who believe. And this idea of overflowing abundance, it's something that we see, over and over again throughout John's gospel.
And, just thinking about that abundance of wine, it kind of makes me think too, no matter what we're going through, no matter what kind of challenges we're facing, God's grace is always more than enough. And it's a comforting thought.
Yeah, it is. And John explicitly tells us that, this miracle had a profound impact on the disciples. It says his disciples believed in him. And so, their faith was strengthened by this display of divine power.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that cleansing of the temple, because we see kind of a different side of Jesus here.
Yeah, we do. The scene is Jerusalem during Passover, and Jesus arrives at the temple and finds, the temple courts just teeming with merchants and money changers. It's a very different picture than what we typically associate with a place of worship.
It's almost kind of jarring, to imagine, especially knowing how, reverent Jesus was towards his father. But what was the purpose of all this commercial activity in the temple in the first place?
Well, pilgrims who were coming to Jerusalem for the Passover, they needed to buy animals for sacrifices. And the money changers were there because people were coming from all different regions with different types of currency, and they needed to exchange their money for the specific type that was required for the temple tax. So, on the surface, it seems like a practical thing, even a helpful thing.
But I get the sense it was a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think so. And, while these activities had, a practical purpose, what had happened is that they had essentially turned the temple into this bustling marketplace. And in doing so, they had really overshadowed its true purpose as a house of prayer and worship.
I wonder how we would react if we walked into our place of worship and it had been transformed into like a flea market. It makes you think about our own attitudes towards worship, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And we see a flash of righteous anger in Jesus here. It says that he made a whip of cords and drove out the animals, overturned the tables, scattered the coins. And so, his actions weren't just about, economics or convenience. They were about protecting the sanctity of a space that was dedicated to God. And, Sproul even connects this scene back to Psalm 69, where David expresses a similar zeal for the purity of God's house.
Wow, that's a powerful connection. It really underscores the importance of approaching God with, reverence and intentionality. But it also raises a question, why does John place this event so early in Jesus' ministry? The other Gospels, they seem to put it, closer to the end. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's one of the, fascinating things about the Gospels is that each author has a unique perspective and purpose. And, one possibility is that Jesus actually cleansed the temple twice. It's likely that this problem just kept recurring, and so he had to address it again later in his ministry.
So it kind of speaks to how easily we can lose sight of what truly matters, even in our religious practices. But so you've got, Jesus confronting this blatant disregard for the sacred space of the temple. What happens next?
Well, the Jewish leaders, understandably, they're upset by this disruption, and they demand some proof of Jesus' authority. They ask him, what sign do you show us since you do these things?
So it's like, who are you to come in here and shake things up like this?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and Jesus' response is both cryptic and profound. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
And of course, they take him literally. They're thinking he's talking about the physical building.
Yeah.
But John makes it clear that Jesus is actually referring to something much deeper.
He's talking about his own body, which would be raised from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion. And so this statement really foreshadows the resurrection, the event that would become the cornerstone of the Christian faith.
So we've gone from this joyous celebration of abundance, at the wedding feast, to this intense confrontation over the meaning of worship in the temple. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and what's remarkable is how these two stories, while they seem unrelated, actually complement each other. They both point toward this fundamental shift that Jesus brings.
At the wedding, we see that abundance of grace symbolized by that overflowing wine. And then in the temple, we see Jesus challenging the way people have come to approach God. He's calling them back to a deeper, more authentic form of worship.
Yeah. And that's just the beginning. There's so much more to explore in John 2.
Yeah, it really is amazing how these two stories, while seemingly, so unconnected, are actually woven together so beautifully. You got the celebration, the joy, the wedding feast, and then it's followed by this intense confrontation at the temple, like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, precisely. And, I think both of these events really highlight a crucial theme that runs throughout John's gospel, and that is that Jesus himself is the new temple, the dwelling place of God's presence.
That's a pretty profound statement. So
Yeah.
it's not just about cleansing a physical building. It's about something much deeper.
Right, exactly. Jesus is challenging that established understanding of where and how God should be worshipped. He's pointing to a new way of relating to God, one that's not confined to, a specific location or ritual.
Yeah, that makes me think about how easy it is, for us to get caught up in the outward forms of religion without really, truly connecting with God at a heart level. We can go through all the motions without actually experiencing the transforming power of his presence.
Absolutely. And that's why I think Jesus' actions in the temple are so jarring. He's disrupting the status quo. He's forcing people to re-examine their priorities and their understanding of what it means to worship.
It's interesting that John describes Jesus' reaction as, zeal for your house. That word zeal, it just has such a powerful connotation. It speaks to a deep passion, a fervent commitment.
Yeah, it really does. And it highlights the depth of Jesus's love for his Father and his desire to see him honored and glorified. This wasn't just a casual annoyance. It was a righteous anger that was fueled by a deep reverence for God.
It kind of reminds me of something that Sproul wrote about, How Jesus actually cleansed the temple twice. It's like the problem kept recurring even after that initial confrontation.
Yeah, it's a fascinating detail, isn't it? It speaks to, I think, that persistent human tendency to stray from true worship, to allow our own desires and agendas to take precedence over God's. Even after a powerful encounter with the divine, we can so easily slip back into old patterns.
It's like we need those regular reminders,
Yeah.
a cleansing of the temple, so to speak, in our own lives to keep us focused on what truly matters. But what does that look like practically?
Yeah.
How do we cultivate that same zeal for God in our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's a question I think we should all be asking ourselves. And I think the answer really lies in understanding that true worship is not confined to, a specific time or place. It's a way of life. It's a posture of the heart that permeates everything we do.
So it's not just about singing hymns on Sunday morning or, praying before meals, although, those things are important too.
Right, exactly. It's about recognizing God's presence in every moment, in every encounter, and responding with gratitude, humility, and a willingness to obey.
I love that it's like seeing the world through a different lens, a lens that reveals the sacred in the ordinary.
Precisely. And that's where the challenge lies, isn't it? To cultivate that kind of awareness, that sensitivity to God's presence amidst all the noise and distractions of everyday life.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to be constantly cleansing the temple of our own hearts, making space for God to dwell within us. But how do we do that practically?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing what those money changers and animals might be in our own lives. What are the things that are crowding out God, that are taking up space in our hearts that rightfully belongs to Him?
Yeah, that's a great question. It could be anything from busyness, distractions,
Right.
unhealthy habits, even certain relationships that pull us away from God.
Exactly. And once we identify those things, we need to be willing to let them go, to drive them out of the temple of our hearts, just as Jesus did in the physical temple. It might require some difficult choices, some uncomfortable confrontations with ourselves, but it's essential if we want to experience true intimacy with God.
Yeah, it's like we need to be as passionate about protecting that sacred space within us as Jesus was about protecting the sanctity of the temple.
Yeah,
It's about guarding our hearts, making sure that they're a place where God can truly dwell.
you're right. And it's not a one-time event.
Okay.
It's an ongoing process, a daily surrender to God's transforming power. It's
Okay.
about allowing Him to cleanse us from the inside out, to reshape our desires and priorities so that they align with His will.
This is making me think about the connection between the wedding at Cana and the cleansing of the temple. In both instances, Jesus is kind of pointing us towards something new, something better.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the wedding feast, emphasizes God's abundant grace, symbolized by that overflowing wine. And then the cleansing of the temple kind of highlights the importance of our response to that grace. It's not enough to acknowledge God's grace. We must also live in a way that honors Him, a way that reflects the transformation He's brought about in our lives.
It's like a dance between the two, or a rhythm of grace and reverence that should characterize our walk with God. We receive His grace with open hands, and we respond with a heart that desires to honor and obey Him.
Beautifully put. Yeah, it's a beautiful picture of what it means to live in right relationship with God.
When we think about it that way, it's almost like those water pots at the wedding feast. They represent our own hearts, ready to be filled with that new wine of God's grace.
What a beautiful image. And it reminds us that this transformation, it's not something that we can do on our own. We need Jesus, the one who turns the ordinary into the extraordinary, the one who cleanses our hearts and makes us fit for true worship.
And it all starts with that simple act of obedience.
Yeah.
Whatever He says to you, it's the same message that Mary gave to the servants at the wedding feast. And it's a message that really resonates throughout John's gospel and beyond.
Yeah, it's a call to surrender, to trust in Jesus's authority, and to allow Him to work in and through us. And as we do, we'll discover that His grace truly is abundant, overflowing into every area of our lives.
So we've explored the symbolism, the controversy, and the deeper meaning behind these two amazing stories in John 2. But I can't help but wonder, where do we go from here? How do we apply these truths to our everyday lives? What does it look like to live out this rhythm of grace and reverence in a world that often feels anything but sacred?
Those are excellent questions. And I think the answer lies in recognizing that true worship. It's not about outward actions or rituals, but about the posture of our hearts. It's about cultivating an inner sanctuary where God can dwell, a space that is free from the distractions and demands of the world.
It's a challenge, though, to maintain that inner sanctuary when, like you said, we're just bombarded with so much external noise, So do you have any practical tips for how we can, create that space for God in the midst of everyday life.
Yeah, I think, cultivating an attitude of gratitude is a great place to start. Even just taking a few moments each day to, acknowledge God's blessings, both big and small, can really shift our perspective and open our hearts to his presence.
I love that. It's like putting on those gratitude glasses and, suddenly the world looks completely different.
Hmm.
It's so
Yeah.
easy to get caught up in complaining about what we lack instead of, appreciating all that we have.
That's so true. Another powerful practice is to create space for silence and solitude. In a world that's constantly bombarding us with information and stimulation, it's so crucial to carve out time for quiet reflection,
Yeah.
to allow ourselves to listen to that still small voice within.
That's one that I have to admit I struggle with because
Uh-huh.
my mind tends to race with, to-do lists and, all kinds of worries the moment things get
Yeah.
quiet.
I understand it takes practice, but even if it's just for 5 minutes each morning, focusing on your breath, quieting your thoughts, and just, simply being present with God, it can make a world of difference. It's about creating that space where you can truly hear from him.
Yeah, it's like hitting the pause button on all the chaos of life
Yeah.
and allowing ourselves to be filled with God's peace. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a discipline worth cultivating.
Definitely. And another key practice, and this might surprise some people, is engaging in acts of service.
Mhm.
Serving others, whether it's, through some grand gesture or just a simple act of kindness can be a really profound form of worship. It takes our focus off of ourselves and directs it towards, loving and caring for those around us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like taking that reverence and gratitude that we've cultivated in our hearts and putting it into action, reflecting God's love in tangible ways.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that, true worship isn't about striving for perfection. It's about progress. It's about continually aligning our hearts and lives with God's will. It's a journey, not a destination.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
So, we can mess up,
Right.
we can stumble along the way and still be, on the right track.
Absolutely. God's grace is sufficient for us, even in our imperfections. He sees our hearts, our desire to honor him, and he meets us right where we are.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the gospel, isn't it? It's not about earning God's favor, but about receiving it freely through faith. And as we experience that grace, it compels us to worship him more fully and live lives that reflect his love.
Beautifully said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into John 2, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We've talked about cleansing the temple, both literally and metaphorically, but what might it look like for you to demonstrate that same zeal for the purity and authenticity of your own worship today?
That's a really powerful question. It's almost like those Jewish leaders asking Jesus for a sign, but now we're asking ourselves, what signs are we showing the world through our worship? Are they signs of joy, gratitude, reverence, and love? Or have we become complacent, allowing distractions to crowd out the sacred estate?
It's a question worth pondering as you go about your day. May you be challenged to cultivate a heart of worship that honors God and inspires others to seek him.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the richness of John 2. And we encourage you to, keep digging into God's word and allowing it to transform your heart and your mind. Until next time, keep diving deep.